Good morning and welcome to Tuesdays with the Pilgrim. Today we continue our trip or journey with a prophet in Babylon with chapter 10, part 1. Renunciation. The League of Service. The words sang in Gaunt's ears night and day. They set the rhythm of his thoughts. They were written in shining letters upon the sky of his dreams. It was an ideal magnificent in its very simplicity, and the more he pondered it, the more clearly he saw that mankind had always been in search of this ideal. It was present in every religion. It was indeed the root of all religions. Even in its most mutilated form, whenever it appeared, it had instantly appealed to the hearts of men. When religion cast it out, it found fresh incarnations in those great secular movements which bound men together for common ends, overspread continents, and created secret confederacies among nations which outlived forms of government and changes of dynasty. It had poured its armies of missionaries into barbarous lands. It had set men fighting behind barricades against intolerable tyrannies. It had made heroes and martyrs out of all who had embraced it. For if man was inherently selfish, he was inherently unselfish too, and was always ready to respond to an ideal which appealed to the highest and best in himself. It was in this latter thought he found his hope. After all, the cardinal characteristics of man did not alter, and among those characteristics the power of unselfish action was as evident as the strength of selfish greed. For if every age revealed man as a selfish animal, continually struggling for his own ends, each age also revealed man as capable of sacrificing himself to his fellows upon any call that he found imperative and authoritative. It might be that this was a selfish and corrupt age, dominated by commercial avarice, but there had been other ages not a whit better, in which men had arisen who had forced the world into higher paths. The cry of the Crusader never rang in vain. Give men a cause worthy of their sacrifice, and men never refused the sacrifice. Was America harder to be moved than all other nations which had preceded her? He could not believe it. He remembered Gordon's words that Americans were a race of idealists, and the more he pondered the saying, the more he recognized its truth. So he had dreamed a vast dream of an America destined to lead the nations of the world in the path of triumphal altruism, having first combined all its forms of religion in one simple synthesis, formulated in that magnificent prophetic vision of Gordon of a church freed from creeds and forms, whose single dogma was the law of service. But between the dream and its realization, there is much hard country to be traversed, a terrible and desert country strewn with the bones of idealists who had failed. Gaunt therefore began to advance with caution. He took Palmer into his confidence, and night after night, when New York slept, the two men sat together discussing plans and schemes. "We must have definite principles rather than a definite plan," Palmer constantly reiterated. "I don't believe in machine-made campaigns. That may be Almolke's idea of German warfare, but it isn't God's idea of spiritual warfare. In this warfare, the man who wins is the man who does not know where he is going. He is content to start right and leave the rest with God." "And what are the principles?" Gaunt replied. "The first is that you can do nothing within the church." "There I am in complete agreement with Gordon," said Palmer. Gaunt still found it difficult to accept this principle because he was more of a churchman than he himself knew. He had been bred into reverence for the church. He had breathed its atmosphere all his life, and in spite of all that had happened, he still loved it. It gave him a homeless feeling to imagine himself shut out from it. "You must start fresh, unhampered by tradition," insisted Palmer. "I don't undervalue the church. It is full of good and kindly people, but they are all of a conventional type. They have always traveled on a good state road, and as long as you keep to the beaten highway, they will follow you. But the moment you enter the wilderness, they will balk at it. they will be afraid. And Gaunt knew that was true. With what infinite difficulty he had forced upon his church a few trifling innovations. Palmer, with kindly irony, reminded him of how trifling these innovations were. You got rid of your pilfering vesper service and established an evening service of the popular type. That's a very modest achievement. But it has cost you weeks of argument, and after all, there are not a dozen of your older members who really approve of the change. You've established a week evening service of the same type, with even more vehement opposition from the older members. That is the total result of 3 months' anxiety and labor. And you can't go much further, remember. Well, it's the thin edge of the wedge, said Gaunt. Yes, and the wedge is now flattening itself against impenetrable masonry. Gaunt smiled a little sadly at the retort, for he felt its truth. He silently reviewed his experiences, and all at once their meaning was made clear to him. He saw how that the element in churches, which was fatal to any real advance, was the element of littleness. They were managed by little people, governed by little ideas. He himself had been consistently engaged in doing little things, and so were most other ministers. And to do these little things, to reconcile disputes, to keep people sweet-tempered, to manage small clubs and societies, demanded as much nerve and skill and patience as were needed to conduct the national government. And it seemed as if there was something inherently enfeebling and belittling in the very atmosphere of a church. Men who knew how to conduct great businesses with skill and success no sooner sat upon the board of church management than they lost their sagacity and power of initiative. In their business houses, they would have divined the need for some vast change of strategy by a kind of intuition, and would have acted on it without a moment's hesitation. They would have taken broad views of things, proved themselves wise and energetic captains of industry, and have known how to meet emergencies with brilliant daring. But in a church, nothing could be done without tedious argument. More words were spent over a matter of a few cents than would have been needed in the business office for the expenditures of thousands of dollars. How was that? What did it mean? And Gaunt saw that it was this belittling atmosphere of the church which was to blame. Every ideal was narrow, parochial. There was no element of imperial thinking. How, then, could he hope to create within the church any sentiment for an ideal that was so new and Catholic, so broad and imperial, as this ideal of a universal league of service was, as the one sufficient synonym of all religions? And he knew that he could not do it. Yes, you're right, he said at last, but think, mercifully, if you can, on my reluctance to accept your view. I respect your reluctance too much to think harshly of it, said Palmer. I myself have experienced it. Years ago, when I broke away from the organized church, I did so with infinite misgivings. I shall never forget the desolation of that hour. I seemed to have left behind me the warm hearthstone of home, to have made myself an outcast who sees nothing confronting him but a homeless waste, and the years stretching out before him, bleak and sterile and interminable. But I was consoled by the thought that I was free. The road might be bleak, but an invigorating air blew over it, and I soon found myself acquiring new strength and moving with a sense of liberty that I had never known. Freedom never disappoints her lovers. All other loves fail, but hers never. Well, so be it, said Gaunt. But although he spoke cheerfully, there was a moisture in his eyes when he recollected all that the church had been to him. He knew that those memories would never leave him. All his life he would see the dim aisle and the painted windows, would hear the soft surge of familiar music, and feel the thrill he had so often felt on entering the pulpit, conscious of the waiting gaze of many hearers. For whatever faults may be alleged against the church, it imposes a quiet fascination on its children, which they are never wholly able to destroy. It calls them with so many voices, and each is a memory. It creates a nostalgia which endures even when the nostalgia of country is forgotten. In the moment of renunciation, Gaunt almost forgot all the faults of the church, as a man forgets when the last parting comes all the errors in the woman he has loved, and recounts nothing but her virtues and her fairness. He remembers with what passion of intoxicating hope he had entered on his work at the Mayfield Avenue Church. With what pride he had watched the growth of that work, how he had brought his young wife there, and all the kindness of that far-off time, and he realized, as he had never done before, how much the church had meant to him. Sleeping and waking through all these 7 years, the church had been with him. He had pictured himself growing old in its service, inheriting a larger reverence and authority with the years, and the last years proving the sweetest in their complete fulfillment of his purposes and hopes. He had even fancifully pictured himself at times the last scene of all, how his final illness would be announced in hushed tones from the pulpit where he had so often stood, how its stages would be followed with anxious hearts, how the funeral hymn so often sung for others would be sung for him, but surely with a deeper feeling than was ever known before, and with organ notes that had more of wailing in them, how his body would lie in state beneath the pulpit, and silent throngs would pass by and leave their offering of tears and flowers, and he would overhear their low comments of affection and remembrance. All that he had imagined, and now he knew that nothing of it was true, or ever could be true. He would go away, and the place that had known him would know him no more, forever. And if he came back, behold, another would possess his heritage, and the old forms of worship would be going on, but he would be forgotten, or remembered only as a recusant. For a moment, a fractional but intense moment, these thoughts and fancies raced through his mind. They passed, and with them the weakness that begot them. For a moment he envied those whose lives lay in smooth places, whose feet moved discreetly in the ordered ways that led to honor among men. And then his manlier mind prevailed. It was as though he felt upon his face that cold, invigorating wind of freedom of which Palmer had spoken, the wind that calls the soul to the open places of the world. And then that thrill which he had so often felt in watching the life of the vast city, that life in which men took chances and disasters with such a smiling courage that a strenuous eagerness of joy, that old strenuous thrill shot through his heart afresh with a violence that was almost painful. Surely in a cause so great he could not be less courageous than this host of men whose incentives to exertion were so much less than his. And suddenly, with that thought, it seemed as though the past itself sank out of sight, and he could have laughed aloud at those morbid fancies which a moment earlier had possessed his mind. A new joy was born in his heart, the joy of going on. It is the most vital of all joys, the oldest, the noblest, out of which have been born all of the adventures of the world, shared alike by the seaman daring the strange seas, the crusader, the pioneer, the soldier, and the spiritual captain, greater than them all, whose beacon light is truth, whose goal is wisdom. And we'll stop there for this week, and next week we'll continue with Chapter 10, Part B. Until then, take care, stay safe, and God bless.